All right, it is the Reasonably Good Life podcast here with your host, Dr. Mike Brooks, and my co-host and intern, Patrick Kennedy. Hi, Patrick. We are here for a second segment, and I have this idea of running kind of a string of different ideas that are all connected to. So if you listen to this podcast, that it's going to weave a bit of a story here. I am working on a book. So some of this material I hope to be in the book later. I'm working on it, but this is about suffering. And so the first one we did was about level 1 suffering. Do you remember about that, Patrick, what we talked about?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's level 1 suffering, that first tenet of Buddhism, which is that there is suffering, which is kind of a really simple and complex starting point for Buddhism, at the same time, I think. It's the whole idea that there is a kind of suffering, level 1 suffering, which is unavoidable.
Exactly. And there's that quote, the pain is inevitable, suffering is optional. And I used quote investigator. I could not find out, who originally said that, but there's some deep truth to it. And we could split hairs over the definition of suffering, but the pain is inevitable portion points to that type of suffering that is unavoidable, that's inherent to the human condition. We fall, we get injured, we get in fender benders, we get sick, we have loved ones, pass away, or they move, and there's some real suffering that is inherent to the human condition. And we talked about this some last time, is we ought to thank our lucky stars for all the benefits of modernity, because historically there used to be a lot more suffering, because even the basic necessities of food, water, shelter, warmth, indoor plumbing, hot showers. I mean, just there were all these things that we take for granted that our ancestors didn't have at all.
Right.
So as bad as we think the world is, we are very fortunate to live in the times we're living now. COVID is an asterisk, because yes, that does kind of suck, but even our current pandemic pales in comparison to the pandemics that our ancestors used to have to deal with. And we talked about smallpox. That the number that boggles my mind is that in its past 100 years of existence, smallpox killed 500 million people before it was eradicated with vaccines. So, for people who don't like the idea of vaccines, we don't want to live in a world without vaccines. There are some really nasty, nasty things that used to kill people, with smallpox having a 30% infected fatality rate. Bubonic plague had about 100%. You caught it, you were dead. So as much as people say, well, what about the harms of vaccines? Well, compared to how virulent some of these diseases were in the past, vaccines are a blessing that we all benefit from. And other benefits of modernity that we talked about. So there is suffering now. There's true suffering. There's that level 1 suffering that still exists right now. But it used to be worse in the past. And that's that life is suffering, that one of the first noble truth in Buddhism.
Right. And I think another interesting figure to consider is the way mental illness, those rates have changed over time. I'd like to see those in comparison to,
yes,
what you might call a quality of living throughout time, and how it's actually increased, suffering that has increased, while our lives in a lot of ways have become so much easier. So I think that's just a whole, whole different idea that's equally fascinating.
Yeah. And the, it is a good point. One of the things that we'll never know is how bad the suffering was, because they didn't measure it. They didn't have the instruments to measure. But one I think about, and touched on it last time, is, probably one of the worst horrible things, death of a loved one, but death of a child is probably one of the worst sufferings that anyone could experience. And historically, about almost 30% of kids didn't live to see their first birthday. So like, if you could measure the suffering of all the parents who lost kids, and about 45% of kids didn't live to the age of 15. So if you think of all the suffering that occurred throughout history of just parents losing their kids, it's immeasurable. So it's really weird, because as you're pointing out, like, why are anxiety and depression rates going up when we have more benefits of modernity that, we'd think we'd be appreciative of and think we would reduce a lot of suffering, but yet there's a lot of suffering. And here's the level 2 suffering of suffering is optional. We're suffering a lot more than we need to, given all the wondrous things that we have in this world today, or most of us, because, there's certainly some parts of the world that suffer tremendously tight level 1 suffering. But when we're talking, America and Sweden, a lot of the Western countries, we have food on the table. We have clean running water. We have a roof over our heads. Again, not everyone, because I know some listeners, oh, well, that's not true because there's homelessness. It's like, yes, but historically, poverty was way worse than it is now. Up to 200 years ago, like, and I said this last time, but like 90 to 95% of the entire world lived in extreme poverty. Now it's less than 9%. So yes, there's suffering, but this insidious, pervasive other type of suffering is I mean, do you hear this in college a lot, Patrick, that anxiety and depression rates are going up?
Yeah, absolutely. And I hear various explanations for it. I think the most popular one in my generation is technology is the issue.
Yes.
Because people look at how technology is developed, and they look at how those mental illness rates have developed, and they think that, maybe correlation here is causation.
Yes. And as we've talked, I don't buy into that, that it's the smoking gun, the world's complicated. There is seldom one explanation for something as complicated as why depression rates are going up or anxiety rates. There are many factors, but we like to make order out of chaos. And by saying it's because of smartphones, that makes sense of things that allows us to sort of like go, that's the problem. And it's
kind of
like
that easy cop out, like somewhat reductionist answer, but there's so many more sides to it.
Yeah, there's so many sides to it. Now, it is complicated, and probably in future episodes, we can go into why some of these things are happening. We talked about it some as hedonic adaptation, is that as things get better, we're so adaptive, we adjust to them, and we have a new set point of a new normal of, of course I have drinking water, it's no big deal. So we only suffer when it's taken away from us, like during our big freeze in Texas last year. I was like, dang, I sure miss running water in a hot shower, but like most of the time I took it for granted. It's like, of course I just go to the faucet and lift the handle and boom, glass of water. It's like our ancestors, think of what they would have killed each other to have such a wondrous thing at their fingertips. So we adapt so quickly that all the good things that we get don't seem very good anymore. And we can reflect on our own experiences, like, how happy did that new smartphone actually make it, or the new car, or the new whatever it is that we thought would make us really happy, and we typically adapt to it. So that leads us to, we're suffering a lot more than we need to, and what do we do about it? So this is the level 2 suffering. So we got the level 1, we can't do much about it. And then there's this level 2 suffering. And I have some juicy quotes because I like juicy quotes, and I'm going to share them with you listeners. And you might have heard some of these. One, a client told me this one, and it always stuck with me. I love this quote. Our worst misfortunes never happen, and most miseries lie in anticipation. And that's H.R. de Balzac. He was a French playwright and political writer or something from a couple centuries ago. But our worst misfortunes never happen, and most miseries lie in anticipation. So this anticipatory suffering is what he's getting at. Now, here's another one. This one you might have heard of. It's often attributed to Mark Twain, but I looked it up and they could not find who originally said it. I am an old man and have known a great many troubles, most of which never happened. That's a beautiful one. Here's one from Seneca, who is a Stoic philosopher from ancient Greece. There is nothing so wretched or foolish as to anticipate misfortunes. What madness it is in your expecting evil before it arrives.
That one's kind of harsh. That one's a little.
It is.
I think I think especially that last one, the message is very clear. Don't worry too much about things, because usually when it happens, just like that, your worrying is over.
Right.
We talked about this earlier, but when I was a senior in high school, I had this what they called a chapel talk that I had to give at the very end of the year in front of the whole school, 700 people. And I was always an anxious kid growing up. Yeah. And so, I was, the weeks leading up to it, extremely nervous, had never given a talk in front of that many people before, much less stood in front of a crowd of that many people before and been the center of attention. So, I was, really anxious about it, reaching out to all my teachers and my family, kind of being worried about this. And then when the time came, I gave the talk. It was great. It was like all of that worrying was for nothing. And it was extremely well received and everything. So it's just like that, all of that time leading up, it felt like all that worrying was for nothing. And I think those quotes really capture that anticipation. Sometimes we can't help it. Sometimes we can't help being worried about something in advance. But when we can think about before it's happening, when we can think about as soon as this happens, all of this worrying, this suffering is going to be over. So yeah, I think it's you can go on the side of invalidation when thinking that you would be a madman to worry in anticipation before the event, but it can be a very helpful thing to remember.
Yes. Yeah. So, what you're pointing to is important too. It's very normal that we have this type of suffering, this anticipatory suffering. And the reason I think we do is because the same brains we have that help us solve problems. One of the things that separate us from animals, and I read this it was in Dan Gilbert's Stumbling on Happiness. He's a Harvard social psychologist, and he happened to be my social psychologist when I was at the University of Texas at Austin. He was my professor, and he moved on to Harvard. But one of the things he said that separates humans from animals is we are experience simulators. In our heads, our noggins are so big, we can think of various things in our heads without actually experiencing them and figure out a plan or how to solve a problem. Like our ancient ancestors, to take down a woolly mammoth, we'll follow the trail this way, we'll separate this one, through here, we can, try to get it to run over the cliff over here, and then we can, carve up the body or whatever, so they didn't actually just run out there and, just say, let's see what happens, because they could be dead, right? It'd be very dangerous. And they had to, like, hunters might, looking at tracks, is like, oh, what kind of animal might that have been that left those tracks? Where was it going? How fast was it going? How recently did it leave those tracks? How many of us need to go after it? That we can think of in our heads and imagine these things. And that helps us solve problems. It helps us reach goals. It helps us, plan for retirement. It helps us create iPhones and all that stuff, because we can imagine like different things and innovate and create. And it's like, okay, great brains. The trouble is we have a built-in negativity bias. And I think we've talked about that. I know I blogged on it a little, but that is why we think the world's always going to hell in a handbasket, is we are tuned in to threats to our survival. Our brains naturally gravitate toward the negative, because our ancient ancestors needed to know if there's, if there's negative news of lions at a watering hole. If we didn't pay attention, we could be dead. But if we didn't pay attention to the good news that there was an apple tree nearby, we'd probably live to see another day. So all this connects is that when we're at rest, our brains tend to drift toward negative because of our ancestral history, our evolutionary history. And they start to think of all the bad things that could happen to us. Our creative brains that are so beneficial to our survival, it's like a double-edged sword. Now they're starting to think of all the bad things that could threaten us. And now we have all these other threats. Well, what if people don't like my Instagram post? Or what if I don't get hired at this job? Or what if I don't get an A on this final and my GPA drops? And if my GPA drops, then I might not get into the right graduate school, like da, da, da,
right.
da.
So in the past, it's like this negativity bias was serving us. It was serving our survival. That's the way we navigated our world, because it helped us stay alive. But now it's kind of mismatched with our environment, when the negative consequences of whatever we're worrying about aren't going to threaten our survival. Like at most, we'll probably just get embarrassed by something extremely small. So I think that's another conversation, is that whole evolutionary mismatch that we've experienced with our negativity bias.
Yeah, and that's the term, is evolutionary mismatch, is the current environment we live in. As you're listening to this in your car, driving down the road at 60 miles an hour, that's very discrepant from what our evolutionary ancestors experienced. And like modernity is just a drop in the bucket compared to our evolutionary history. So our brains, we basically have the same brains we had 10,000 years ago. I mean, they're not much, evolution doesn't, change our brains that much. But society, what we've created with these big brains is very governments and, flat tax rates versus progressive, and how much freedom we should have in a democracy. And it's like, our brain, it's like, that makes no sense in terms of our evolutionary history. So it's really weird. What mandate should there be about vaccinations? It's like, that makes no voter rights, it just goes on and on. So our brains, though, those can still be like these existential threats to our existence. What if people don't like me? Social rejection, that has an evolutionary basis, that we need to worry about social rejection, because being part of our group, our tribe, meant survival and life, and being cast out from our tribe meant death. But now we have, where we get cancel culture of like, or I texted the wrong thing, and like people don't or blasting me, or all those things. It's like, now we've got all these other threats that our ancestors didn't have to deal with, but they still tap these nerves in us, like worrying about.
In a way, it's it's kind of rough because we have the same level of worry that our ancestors did. According to the numbers, maybe a little bit more in terms of how it affects us in terms of our, our mental health. But it does still serve us in a way, because if you think about it, without that worrying ahead of time, without that anticipation, maybe we wouldn't have the motive to think about these things in advance, in situations where it does benefit us, like
Right.
thinking about how we're going to give a presentation and how different things might go wrong. If we're organizing an event, thinking about all of the different aspects that go into making it successful, we may not have the motivation to think about those things if it didn't worry us a little bit. So I think that, the key there
Right.
is keeping that worry in check, and using it to our advantage, and thinking,
Yeah.
okay, maybe I'm a little worried for a reason, and there's a way that I can think about these things ahead of time in anticipation without letting it get to me on an existential level. So it
Right.
can be, that pain can be informative in some ways, instructive.
I think it can be. I think you're right. It's like, does the level of worry or anxiety, does it match the level of actual
Mm,
threat though? So I think
mm,
that's where we get in trouble, is we have these exaggerated, like, oh, it'll be a disaster, like your presentation one. And I can think of a few for me where anxiety really got the best of me. And here's what I'm thinking is, like, I'm a psychologist. I've studied this. I know the mechanisms, I mean, this is what I do for a living, is help people. And I'll still get, my anxiety, it'll get the best of me
mhm,
sometimes. So I remember one, a few years ago, probably the most anxious I'd been in quite some time. And if your parents out there, you'll recognize this one is, my son was, I think, in first grade, and I got home early enough, and he's going to get off the bus, and I was there, and it's like, well, he didn't get off the bus. And I was like, did
mm,
he get off at a different stop, like, and he's walking. I was like, oh, I don't see him, so started thinking, I was like, well, where is he, like, oh, I know, he was expecting a parent pickup, like he's sitting there, and or he took the wrong bus or something. And I started going, and I can feel my heart rate beating a little
mhm,
faster, and and my pulse, and I'm like, okay, well, I'll call the school. And they're like, he's not there, and I was like, okay, he's, this teacher, and can you check with her? And they're, the person, the attendant, they're like, okay, well, okay, no, it's not here. The teacher said she didn't know where he is, and I was like, oh.
oh
And
no.
I felt, like my heart beating faster and faster. And then I was like, oh my God, where is he? Like, and then in my head, all the abduction stories start
Mhm,
going through my head, and
mm,
America's Most Wanted, and like these horrible things where kids get abducted, and I'm running around. And I'm literally starting to run around. This is all taking place within like 30 minutes, multiple calls, calling my wife, just calling around, trying to call the grandparents, but they weren't picking up. I'm leaving frantic messages. I start like banging on my neighbors' doors, to get them out. It's like, I can't find, my son. Can you, and I call back the school, and they're like, well, I think we need to file a police report right now. And
mhm.
what was he wearing last? And, I'm literally
Jeez.
at the verge of a total panic attack. You can tell, I just like talking about this works me up. And I'm frantic, and I'm like,
Mm,
all these thoughts going through my head. Then my, my mother-in-law drives up, and she's got my youngest and my middle son in there, and I'm like, where, where was,
where's my son?
yeah, where my son? Yeah, and she goes, she's from Denmark. She's like, oh, you remember, you told me to pick I said I was going to pick him up from school, and I picked him up, and then I went to pick up his older brother at middle school. I mean, you told me. And I was like, I couldn't even get mad at her because she was absolutely right. And I totally flipped my lid, and it probably took me an hour to come down from that one. And I was thinking, damn, that was a miss. That was
Oh my God.
that was only a few years ago, and it's like, I'd been doing this stuff forever, but I totally went into fight or flight mode. It was like total, hypothalamus and, my amygdala or whatever, where it's like adrenaline, the cortisol, and I was just flooded. And I'm thinking about it afterwards. I suffered. I did suffer. No, there's no doubt about it. I suffered.
Mm-hmm.
Did I need to? No, I didn't.
Mm.
Nothing happened. Like, our worst misfortunes never have. Most miseries lie in anticipation. I was anticipating, this horrible thing, and it was floating in my head, but it didn't happen. And, I still have them, where I'll give a presentation and, I don't hear from them. And I'm like, oh, maybe I flubbed it. Maybe they're mad at me. Maybe I said something offensive, and I'll, no, Mike, don't go down that rabbit hole. But it's really hard to, and you get worked up. Now I think of, if we were to wear a sufferometer, it's like a Fitbit for suffering. Imagine that we could do that. And I know some suffering. Fitbit for suffering. I know, like, they have mood rings and things that like pick up your, galvanic skin response. I don't know what they have, all these high-tech devices, but, imagine we had one that measured our day-to-day suffering, and how much suffering would be measured over things that didn't happen, or if they did, they weren't near as bad. They were a fraction of as bad as we imagine them to be. See, our imagination's so powerful that we can imagine some pretty horrendous things. And because of that negativity bias, that's where we go. Like, we go down these rabbit holes, and it keeps causing us to suffer tremendously when we don't really need to. And you're listening to this now, you can probably identify with some of these stories and go, just think of some of the times where you really got bent out of shape about something and it didn't happen, or it wasn't near as bad. And as you said, Patrick, like, even when it's bad, like, imagine you'd given a speech and it was high school, right? So imagine you gave that speech and it wasn't a hit, but it wasn't a disaster. It's not like you blew up the stage and, your pants fell down and stuff like that. It's like, let's just say you gave a speech that was okay. People like nod their heads. Now I want you to think back to, you've been to lots of speeches before, right?
Right.
No, and listeners, I want you to think of this. Think back to someone else's absolutely disastrous presentation or speech. So I want you to take a moment, think about it. Can you think of one, Patrick?
I'm going to be honest, I can't.
Right.
Like, I know I've seen some pretty bad ones.
You have. I have too. Yeah. And so that means, like, even if you'd given one that was, even a disastrous one, what would people be thinking of your presentation now?
I mean, I forget them. People every day probably forget the next day.
Exactly.
When they see something like that.
Exactly. Like, we
blow it out of proportion.
It's totally blown out of proportion. And that's like, even if a worst one, if it's just okay, which is most likely the case, not the worst disaster. But the thing is, even the worst disasters don't impact us. We might go to our friends, wow, that was a bad speech. They forgot everything they're going to say. It didn't make any sense, and their PowerPoint didn't work, and their jokes weren't very funny. You tell our friend and they'd go, yeah, I've been to those before. And then how much would we think about it afterwards?
And
nothing. I mean,
your day.
Yeah. And we know this from our own experiences. We can reflect. Now, here, we'll flip it. what about the best presentation you've ever seen? I want you to think of the one that knocked your socks off.
I can definitely remember a lot more than.
Yeah, right. Now you probably come up, but even then, how often do you think about those on a daily basis? Like,
None.
I remember that presentation 5 years, 3 months, and 17 days ago that was given by Joe Smith. And oh my God, I think about it every day and how much he's changed my life. It's like we don't, even the worst or the best, we don't think about, much less the ones that are just okay. Like so it's like, it just doesn't matter most of the time, those things that but yet beforehand, we're like, oh my God, my life's on the line here. If I don't do this just right, I'll be a laughing stock. I'll be blacklisted, I'll be the butt of jokes for memes. And it's like, well, mostly not. Now, some of you, this kind of flies into the whole cancel culture, because there are those where you get caught on video,
right. There's the unfortunate view. When you said memes, I think, oh, well, maybe there is a little bit more potential for that moment.
Yeah, there is
captured in history, but even those go away.
Yeah, even those go away, and most likely it's not going to be us, our very, very worst case,
right.
Because we can think of those. So that is kind of like where we get to, is recognizing our suffering is like, okay, some of it's real and, level 1 suffering, a lot of it's level 2 suffering. And I think part of our life's work is trying to distinguish which it is, and say, wait a second, do my emotions, is this anticipatory suffering? Am I catastrophizing, is a word you've probably read. Am I thinking like, oh, my life will be ruined if this X, whatever happens or doesn't happen? And I think, to me, that goes back to like that serenity prayer is it, God grant me the serenity to accept the
things I cannot change,
the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Yes. Okay. So it's very close to that, listener. If we didn't nail it, it was very close.
I'm sorry. I'm so sorry if you got it wrong.
You've heard it before. Here, Patrick, look it up real quick to see if we got it right. Dude, no one will know, Patrick. Look it up. This is the internet. We don't have to guess anymore. We can find out exactly. But that idea is, if it's something we can change, we're worrying about it. Oh, I have a speech. Well, prepare for it, Don't just walk up there and make it up as you go, rehearse it, prepare for it. Yes. Use that noggin to say, right. Okay, the courage, okay, I'm going to work on this thing. But if it's something you can't change, like I have a camping trip planned this weekend and it might rain. Okay, well, worrying about the rain doesn't change whether it's going to rain or not. Now, you can, we say, well, that would be a bummer. Okay, accept it. Oh, that is a bummer. Accept it may rain on it. And then what can I do about it? Oh, can we prepare for it and get our rain gear? We'll keep checking the weather. We'll, so it's not throw up your hands, but it's kind of differentiating. If there's something I can do about this, do it. And if there's not, then our work is on acceptance,
Right.
The Dalai Lama said something like this in The Art of Happiness, and it stuck with me. And I think he got it from another Buddhist monk from hundreds of years ago, Shantideva, that he was inspired by. And he said, he was being asked, like, do you worry or stress? And he said, well, I think to myself, if there's something I can do about this thing, I do it. If there's nothing I can do about it, then why worry? It's like, okay, well, it's a serenity prayer. It goes back to, right? So I think that's some of our work in life is to use our powerful intelligence to recognize that we often freak out about things that we don't need to, or the other is ruminate about things from the past of woulda, coulda, shouldas. And it's like, well, we don't have a time machine, so we can learn from the past and say, oh, I made a mistake there. What can I learn? But like reviewing it over and over and over just makes us feel like crap after a while. You got to like accept it and say, I screwed up there. I screwed up. That doesn't make me a screw up. You got to do that. I screwed up, but that doesn't make me a screw up.
Right. Don't over-identify with the mistake or the emotion.
And I think that might be a good note to end on, because that's a topic. Attachment and suffering is a big one, and something I think we could talk about next episode. Attachment and suffering. How does that strike you? All right. So this has been The Reasonably Good Life. I've been your host, Dr. Mike Brooks, with my co-host, Patrick Kennedy. I hope you've enjoyed today's episode. Like us, share us. I hate doing all that stuff, but this is the world we live in. And, we hope it was at least a reasonably good podcast for you listeners, or listener, as I keep joking, for the few, the proud, our podcast listeners. And we look forward to the next one, in which we'll go over attachment and suffering. We hope to see you then.